Chapter 20. The New Regime of Vietnam. The days after April 30th, 1975. April 30th, 1975. It was a day that split our lives into the before and the after. To the Viet Cong, it was a day of victory, a final moment in history as it closed its chapter. But to the Vietnam Cong Hoa regime and to the families like ours, it was the beginning of a wound that would take generations to heal. That morning, my father was sitting quietly in the living room, the newspaper folded neatly on his lap. He had just turned 58 that year, only beginning to taste the calm of retirement after decades of serving in the veterinary field. He was a man who loved quiet things, animals, gardens, evenings with his children around him. He was not a soldier, not a politician, just a man who wanted to live out his days in peace, yet fate does not spare even the quiet ones when history changes. Through the window, I still saw the yellow flag with 3 red stripes still fluttering. Though the wind seemed heavy that day, that flag had always been more than cloth to us. It was the heartbeat of the Republic of Vietnam, the symbol of a homeland my parents had trusted, sacrificed, and built their lives upon. By midday, the radio cracked with news. Tanks had rolled through the streets and the gates of the Independent Palace has fallen. My father sat very still, his eyes closed, while the announcer's voice declared that the liberation was complete. Outside, I could hear some neighbors shouting, some even clapping. But our house was quiet, filled with the sound of our mother's muffled sobs. In the afternoon, the soldiers came, not to our door but marching down the main street. They moved with confidence, their uniforms a deep green, their rifles glinting in the sun, and above them, on the highest pole of the palace, the yellow flag was taken down slowly, deliberately. It was lower, and in its place rose the red flag with a single yellow star. That image pierced my father's heart more deeply than any play could have. He didn't cry. He was not a man of tears, but his face became pale and he turned away from the TV screen as though unable to watch the final breath of the country he had served. My mother placed her hand on his shoulder, but he remained silent. The silence was heavier than her sobs. That night, Saigon was restless. Some streets were eerily quiet, while others were alive with shouts of victory. People poured into the boulevards, waving red flags. But in our home, we drew the curtain close. We did not celebrate. We sat in the dimly lit room, eating a simple meal of rice and vegetables, listened to the distant noise of fireworks that did not feel like a celebration to us, but rather like a thunder at a funeral. My father tried to reassure us. He said softly, "We must stay together. That is all it matters." But I could hear the bitterness in his voice. For the first time in my life, I realized that even father, a pillar of strength in every household, could feel powerless. The next morning, loudspeakers were set up at every street corner. They played songs of triumph, slogans about unity and liberation, but to us it was noise that drowned out our grief. Everywhere we looked, the new flag was present, on government buildings, on schools, even hanging on the balconies of neighbors who wanted to prove their loyalty. The yellow flag of our past had disappeared as it had never existed. My mother whispered, "It feels like we had lost our country without leaving our home." And indeed, that was the cruelest part. The streets was the same. The bougainvillea still bloomed by the gates. The bicycles still rattled down the lanes. Yet everything was different. Overnight, we had become strangers in our own city of Saigon. In those first days after the fall, our family lived in the fog of disbelief. We did not yet know about the re-education camps. The days after April 30th were filled with confusion, rumors, and fear. The new government called for calm, assuring people that life would go on as usual, that those who have served the puppet regime would simply need to a short period of re-education. They make it sound like a harmless school program, a few weeks of study, nothing to fear, but the air of Saigon told another story. Not long after the flag changed, loudspeakers began to announce directives. All men who have served in the South Vietnamese military, police, or government must report themselves to the nearest office. They were to bring clothing, mosquito nets, and personal items for 10 days of study. My father sat listening quietly as the announcement repeated itself over and over, carried across the city by speakers strapped to poles. He said nothing, but we all looked at him, our hearts trembling. "Ba, will they call you too?" one of us asked timidly. He shook his head slowly. "No, I was not a soldier. I was not an officer. I work with animals, not weapons. They will not take me." And he was right, because he had spent his life in veterinary field. He was not considered a threat. But relief did not wash away the fear. We saw our neighbors, men that had known for years, packing small bags, hugging their wives, kissing their children before walking out the door to report. Some tried to smile, promising they would be back in 10 days, but everyone's eyes betrayed doubt. I remember the silence that fell after the first group left. Their families waited. 10 days passed, then weeks, then months. The men did not return. Stories began to spread. Whispers of camps in the jungles. Men forced to cut bamboo, to dig ditches, to farm in remote valleys, to endure endless lectures about Marxism and revolution. Some came back years later, thin, broken, with eyes that seemed to carry shadows that would never lift. Others never returned at all. Our neighbor had been an officer in the Air Force. He left one morning, walking tall, reassuring his wife that he would soon be home. She clung to him, tears streaming down her face. We stood at our gate and watched as he disappeared down the street. Months later, his wife still went to the local office asking for news, but all she received was silence. Her children grew thinner, her eyes hollow. She would lie up at dawn to bring him food parcels when allowed, carrying them across the city with the hope that he might at least taste something from home. Each time she returned, her face revealed more despair. My father was spared, but he bore the weight of witnessing so many others disappear. At night he paced the living room, hands clasped behind his back, the way he did when deep in thought. How can they survive in those camps? He whispered once to my mother. They are men of the city, teachers, clerks, officers. They have never farmed in the jungle. How can they endure? My mother answered only with silence because there were no words of comfort left. I felt both gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that my father remained with us, that we did not have to watch him vanish behind camp gates. Guilt because other children lost their fathers, while I still have mine at the dinner table, and a strange burden to carry. Thankfulness laced with sorrow, joy mixed with shame. In those early months, the camps became a shadow hanging over every household. Wives learned to manage without husbands, children without fathers. The streets of Saigon grew quieter, filled with women on bicycles, family adjusting to absence. When men were gone, and their voices echo only in memories. At home, my father became both anchor and witness. He worked quietly, helping my mother with whatever he could, but I could see in his eyes the grief he carried for friends who were not as fortunate. The truth is, no answer ever came to us, only silence, only the knowledge that life grew as it was, had chosen for us. And so we held on to one another, clinging tighter, because the thought of losing him to those camps was more than we could bear. The household registration and rice rations. In the re-education camps, tore fathers from families, the household registration system chained the rest of us to the state. Within weeks, carters came to every neighborhood, ordering each family to report to the local authority. We were declared every member in our household, name, age, occupation. From then on, our existence would be defined not by freedom, but by a small brown booklet called the Hộ khẩu. I still remember standing in line at the War Office, families crowded together, clutching documents. Behind the desk sat young men and women in green uniforms, stern-faced, pen scratching across forms. Each name they wrote became a mark of control. They did not smile, nor did they need to. Power was in their hands, and they knew it. When it was our turn, my father stepped forward, his back straight, though I saw the tension in his jaw. He gave our names one by one, his voice steady. The carter wrote them down, asked questions, checked our papers, and finally stamped our household record book. That small book became the key to everything. Without it, we could not get rice rations, travels, or even remain in our home. It was both identity and leash. From that moment on, rice was no longer something we bought freely at the market. It was measured rations and counted against the number of people in our household. Each person received a fixed amount, never enough to satisfy hunger. My mother became skilled in stretching every grain, adding sweet potatoes, cassava, even thin porridge to fill our bowls. Meals were quiet affairs. The clatter of chopsticks replaced the laughter in once filled our table. I watched my parents with a mixture of sadness and awe. They had once been providers, strong and capable. Now they were forced to stand in lines for hours under the sun, to bow their heads to officials barely older than their children. Yet they endure because there was no other choice. The whole khẩu book was kept carefully in the drawer, as precious as gold. My mother checked it often, making sure it was safe, for to lose it meant losing the right to eat. We had become prisoners, not behind bars, but within our own home, bound by that booklet that dictated how much rice we could place on our table. Hunger is not only the absence of food, it is the presence of humiliation. It was a shame of standing in line, of begging for extra ladle of rice, and watching your children sleep with empty stomachs while you could do nothing. It was the fear of the carters, calling for surprise inspections, checking if anyone had extra rice hidden away. People whisper about neighbors punished for hoarding or accused of trading on the black market. Yet within the hardship, our family grew closer. My mother learned to stretch every grain, making rice soup with more water, mixing sweet potatoes or cassava into our meals, and teaching us children to share without complaining. My father, though silent, gave us the greatest gift of all, his presence. While many families lost their fathers to the re-education camps, we still had ours at home. Even in hunger, we had his quiet strength, his protection. Looking back, those days taught us something that no government could erase: the resilience of a family bound by love. The whole khẩu may have reduced us to numbers in the ledger, the ration cards may have starved us, but at our table in the dim light we were still a family, together, enduring. The currency exchange of September 1975. If hunger tightened its grip on our bodies, the currency exchange crushed the little security my parents had left. It was a day that made the past years of hard work, careful saving, and sacrifices feel like they had been erased overnight. Money was more than bills. It was a measure of our dignity, our labor, our hope for the future. And on that September day, all of it became meaningless. The announcement came in the morning. All South Vietnamese đồng would be abolished. Citizens were to bring their money to the local office to exchange it for new liberation đồng, and each person was limited to 200 đồng. Everything above that would no longer be valid. When my parents heard that news, they went silent, staring one another with faces pale and tight. My father removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and breathed slowly. My mother's hands trembled as she pressed them together, muttering a quiet prayer for protection. Father had always been carefully with money. Every đồng he earned had been counted, saved, tucked away for rainy days, for education, for emergencies. Now, the system reduced it all to a tiny fraction. We walked to the local office together, carrying stacks of bills, envelopes bulging with waste of years. The street was lined with people doing the same, a silent army of despair. Some whispered complaints, others did not speak at all. At the counter, the officials worked quickly, counting, stamping, and discarding bills with mechanical precision. My father placed his envelopes down, his hands steady but his body tense. The clerk glanced at him, took some of the bills, and handed back the new note, a tiny amount, barely enough for a few days of rice. Most of what he had saved, what my parents had relied upon to survive after losing their jobs and homes, were gone in an instant. Father did not speak, but I watched the subtle tremor in his jaw, the way his hands lingered over the new bills. They looked alien in his palms, foreign and powerless. My mother, standing close, grabs his arm, whispering, "At least we still have each other." But her words could not mask the weight of helplessness in the air. On the walk home, father's back seemed heavier than ever, bowed not with age, but with the invisible weight of the future that had been stolen from him. The streets of Saigon were filled with people clutching what remained of their wealth, moving silently, avoiding eye contact, haunted by the knowledge that their labor had been stolen by an order on paper. That evening, at our small dinner table, father laid the new bills in front of us. We stared at them in silence, recognizing that their value was more symbolic than real. What had once represented years of sacrifice and security was now just paper, and yet it carried a reminder of everything we had lost. Father said nothing. My mother reached for his hand, her grip firm, steadying both of them. They did not speak much that night, for there were no words that could comfort the grief of watching one's life savings vanish in the span of a morning. The currency exchange taught us a bitter lesson that security, even earned with diligence and honesty, could be snatched away in an instant. It reminded us that our survival would depend not on money but on resilience, on patience, and on the quiet endurance that my parents embody every day. From that day forward, Saigon underwent significant changes. Markets emptied, shops closed, and ordinary life became struggle for survival. Families bartered for foods in back alleys. Food became currency, and the black market, though dangerous, became a lifeline. Father never complained, never revealed his pain in words, but I saw the quiet sorrow etched in his face, the lines deepening overnight. It was a grief for what was gone and for the children who would now inherit the world of scarcity and fear. And yet, amid the humiliation and the loss, my parents remained steadfast. Father continued to provide in small ways, helping the neighbors with animals or assisting with minor chores, quietly asserting that even stripped of money and rank, a man's value lay in his deeds and his care for the family. My mother managed the household with unwavering determination, ensuring that every grain of rice and every strap of cloth was used wisely. Together we bore the weight of the new reality with dignity, teaching us children that strength was not in wealth but in endurance. The book burnings. If the loss of our saving left our stomachs empty, the burning of books left our hearts hollow. One morning, loudspeakers announced that all materials from the former regime, textbooks, novels, maps, and history books, were to be surrendered and destroyed. The authorities insisted that it was necessary to liberate the people from own ideology. But to us, it felt like erasing the memory of our lives, our culture, and our education. Father gathers the books from our home, history books from school, novels from mother's youth, even notebooks my siblings have filled with dreams and exercises were bundled together. Each book was a word, a story, a lesson, a memory of a time when life had meaning beyond survival. Now they had to go. My mother's hands shook as she carried stacks to the street, tying them carefully with string. Neighbors brought their own bundles, and soon the corner of the street became a massive pile. Children stood nearby, their small hands brushing against the books they had once treasured. Uncertain why the adults looked so serious, so fearful. Flames were set, and the smell of burning paper filled the air. Artgrid and choking was turned into smoke, pages turned into ash. I watched my father stand beside the fire, silent, his face pale. He did not touch the books, did not cry out, but his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the city's lost memory. I remember my mother clutching my hand. Everything they burn is knowledge. Everything they destroy is our past, she whispered. Her voice trembled, barely audible over the crackle of fire. But they cannot burn our memories. We must remember for them. The fire burned for hours, consuming years of printed knowledge. People murmured as they watched, some weeping quietly, others standing rigidly, pretending not to care. I realized then it was not just books being destroyed, it was an attempt to erase who we were, what we had learned, and what we had believed. My siblings and I tried to save a few items, small notebooks, scraps of paper, and few worn novels, but the authorities were vigilant. Anything kept was dangerous. Father whispered that we must be careful, that every single notebook hidden in the wrong place could bring trouble. That night we gathered what we had salvaged in secret, hiding it in corners, under floorboards, behind cupboards. They were small pieces of the past, but no one could take from us entirely, yet loss was still heavy. Even after the fire, the smell of smoke lingered in the air. It was a reminder every time we stepped outside, every time we passed the burned piles on the street, the act of watching knowledge and culture being destroyed left an invisible scar in our family. Father, who had always cherished learning and understanding, seemed quieter after that day. Mother's eyes carried the shadow of grief. We children were maybe too young to fully comprehend, but we felt the hushed conversations and the heavy silence at night. The book burnings taught us a lesson that no school could teach. Survival required memory, but survival also demanded silence. Knowledge could be dangerous in the world that sought to rewrite history. And yet, in our home, my parents quietly promised that we would remember every story we had learned, every lesson we had learned would be repeated to the next generation. If the government could destroy books, it could not destroy the family, the love, the memories that live within us. Those days were dark. The fire consumed what we have loved, but it could not consume us. Father's presence, mother's care, and the bond we share as family became our refuge. We learned to live with loss, to endure with dignity, and to protect the pieces of our past that still matter, hidden, whisper, cherished in the quiet corners of our home. Reflection of a new life. Despite everything, love survived. The scarcity, the fear, the control could not touch the bond that held our family together. Father's presence was a shield, mother's care was a refuge. We survived because they survived, and they survived because of their love for us. Even in the darkest days, there was laughter, shared in whispers, stolen moments that reminded us we were still alive, still human, still a family. Looking back, I realized that those days, filled with hunger, fear, and loss, taught us resilience. We learned to endure without complaint, to find hope in the smallest acts, to treasure what could not be taken, family, memory, and the quiet strength of those we love. My parents, who have lost almost everything, became the embodiment of that strength. They taught us that even when life shrinks, love can expand to fill the emptiness. And so, amid the ashes of books, the emptiness of our cupboards, and the weight of a city under new rule, we live, we love, we survive, and in that survival, we carry the seeds of hope for the future that one day might bloom again. The end of chapter 20, to be continued.
Tell me all about this name, and it's difficult to say. It was given me the day I was born. Want to know about the stories of the empire of old? My eyes say more of me than what you dare to say.